You know, around Halloween and Christmas, you can actually salvage a lot of it. The one thing you got to do is do a little test burn of it and make sure it hasn't been treated with a fire retardant. Anything that's been used indoors, apparently for a display, has got to be sprayed with fire retardant. There's actually a YouTube video of somebody burning straw that's been treated with fire retardant. So if you want to, if you can't really tell, you can go look for that video and see.
What about covering it with compost?
It's kind of a waste of compost. You'd want to dig in the compost.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could if you had nice chunky bark mulch. You could do that. It's just you don't want that bark mulch to mix into your soil too much.
Right.
So you could spread it and then remove it almost like a fabric, if you would. So let's see.
What about newspapers?
Yeah, you could try that. I think that would be okay.
I'm just asking because I did that one year just to keep the weeds from growing, and partly because
Did it work?
And it kept the weeds from growing. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that the ink they use now isn't toxic.
I heard that soy-based ink is the norm now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds fine to me. So there's a lot of strategies on watering, and what I try to do is I try to keep my soil at like a damp sponge level, like a damp wrung out sponge. So I try not to let it really dry out. There's a school of thought that says that really you should water maybe once or twice a week really deeply. That's another way of doing it. I find when I try that, my soil gets so dry that by the next time that I water it, the water doesn't really spread out. It just seems to find the one crack where it can go down. But you know, this is one of these things where there's a lot of different philosophies. I water with a fan nozzle attachment to try to simulate rain as much as possible. If you just go with kind of the bare hose, it'll tend to compact wherever it's hitting.
So we get drip hose kind of set up.
Yeah, drip's fine. And also, what I'm doing with this, I try to tilt it upside down, again, to soften the blow of the water on the soil. So this picture, so we've got our shade cloth up the front, and at the top here, just like what I passed around. Here is the shaded part of the soil, and here's the non-shaded part of the soil that's all dried out. And I was just really struck by this because I never thought that the shade cloth was having that much of an impact, but this is probably dry at least an inch down, where this is still damp on the surface, and they were watered the same amount. I see a lot of people whose spaces look something like this over winter, and it's totally avoidable. What you can do instead is you can plant a cover crop. You know, I've got my fava, I've got some vetch in there, and the cereal rye, and it's super easy to do. You can really, a lot of the garden stores will have a mix that you can buy by the pound. You just scatter it on preferably on a rainy day when we do get rain, and make sure it stays damp for about a week, and then you can forget about it all winter.
Does it need sun?
It doesn't actually.
Because there are large parts of Brisbane that don't get any sun at all.
Yeah, I think this will be fine, especially cereal rye. It's good in winter type settings.
And do you suggest then integrating that back into the soil come springtime to build up soil carbon? And
You can do that. I think the better thing to do is, and you can't see my compost, there's the corner of my compost pile. The better thing to do is to do a formal compost pile that's like half straw, half grains, and half greens. I layer it like a pizza, like a wedding cake, and I don't even turn mine. I just leave it, and 6 months later, by the time I get to the next season, I sort of peel off the top, which is dried, and underneath I have plenty of compost, so that's what I'm doing. If you do dig it into the soil, the thing is, for about a month, that's going to be a draw on the nitrogen in your soil. So if you were to dig in and then the next week plant your seedlings or your seeds, they're going to be competing. So it's not going to be as good. But if you were to do that, Yeah, I guess you could do it like maybe a month ahead of time, but then you're gonna still wanna cover the soil with something, so then you maybe cover the soil with garden cloth or something. Yes, sir.
I tend to chop it down and just let it lay. It still has a nitrogen while it's drying because you're not absorbing it back into the soil. So when it just dries there, that's also a shadow barrier for the soil too. And about a month later, then you can start turning it in, and works pretty much the same. Or you can put it right in your compost too if you're not going all.
Yeah, it just depends on the degree to which you're trying to capture fertility. If you're trying to really maximize that fertility, you want to get it into a pile, into a composting process to get worked in. But you can use it as a soil cover. The key thing is to keep that soil covered one way or another. Let's see, so one of the important things that I do to keep my soil covered is plant spacing. I'll tell you what that means. So it turns out that these two spaces actually have the same number of lettuces in them. But if we're looking at this, you can imagine that this takes much less water, right? First of all, because there's less soil to water, but also because these spaces in between here are all going to dry out. And that's going to be a draw on the water over here. Whereas over here, you see the canopy's extended to cover all of that. And it's quite amazing, even on a hot day, to kind of feel underneath the canopy like this and feel that the soil is still moist. So I'm a big proponent of this. And in order to get this, what I do is a lot of transplanting.
Sir, I found that the weeds in between, if I plant them close, I gotta get down with my hand instead of using a rake.
So here's what I do is I'll weed ahead of time before I plant, right?
Yeah.
And then what'll happen is, because I'm transplanting when they're about this size, right? I keep a real close eye for about 2 to 3 weeks. Because the weeds are so tiny that they're going to be small next to this. Then what happens is they form a canopy, and only the most brave and most strong weeds can poke through, and then they're easy to pull out. So that's my strategy on there.
Doesn't work.
Okay.
I'll try it.
Yeah,
So-
play with it.
And I gotta ask, back to the previous slide, I mean, you got, what, cilantro there, parsley, in the next slide?
And this one, this is these are parsnips.
Parsnips, okay, that's very similar. Okay, you're running those like in a little seed bed and then transplanting them, or?
Yeah, I do it actually.
Those seed?
I made these boxes. And so I do a mix of half garden soil, half compost. That's my expensive fancy mix. And they grow great in that. And then, see, this is about 3 inches deep. So when they get about 3 inches above the soil, that's about all of the growth I'm going to get out of it. And then I'll put them
So
into
basically like a few weeks, and
Yeah, it depends on the type. Like parsnips tend to take about a week to germinate even in good conditions. One of the things actually I like about doing seedlings in this is I can move this around. Also, a neat trick is that the seeds that we're growing don't need light to germinate. So I can actually put it in a container like this. I can put a lid on this and I have a mini greenhouse. So I can just water this and spray it and all of that, and it stays nice and moist and nice and warm. And once it starts germinating, then I move it into the sun.
so are you saying across like a pretty wide spectrum of crops? Because I'm thinking,
The exceptions I've seen are wild strawberries, which don't seem to germinate anyhow. And there's certain types of flowers. But
we're talking root crops and all leafy greens.
yeah. I haven't found, I mean, you saw my list of what I grew, right? So,
I'm sorry, I can.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I haven't found anything that I know anybody who grows.
Like that.
Yeah, so that's actually a neat trick, because then like I have this in a sunless patio where I can keep an eye on it. But the key thing is, as soon as it pops, you got to move it to the sun, or it'll get leggy. They'll literally grow half an inch overnight
Yeah.
and get leggy. But before then,
Okay.
you can play with it. Yeah. I really struggled my first years with germination, and it turned out what was happening was the seeds were drying out. And I think that's the problem. So for instance, if you've got something that you really must plant directly in your garden, like maybe you want to do carrots, I would say,
usually do those by seed.
yeah, and I would say it's critical in that case. I would even do a double layer. So I would do one layer of maybe the burlap after I plant that, right, to lock in that moisture. And I might even do a second layer of suspending a shade cloth above, so that I keep that as moist as possible. Moisture is the name of the game when it's germination. That's
And then
what nobody tells you.
once they pop up, you have to check it every day to make sure.
Yeah, and if you're lucky, within a few days, they're coming up. Yeah. That'll also keep the birds off them too.
Birds here are a big problem.
So did the carrots just come right up through the burlap?
You'll want to remove it before that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, as soon as you see anything emerging, you want to remove it.
What are your thoughts on thinning out carrots? Because they're really small seeds, and it's always been an interesting challenge, and I've worked with a lot of different varieties over the years. I don't like to thin, so I get big carrots and small carrots, usually.
Yeah, I think honestly, at the end of the day, we're not doing this to make a living or optimize whatever. I'd say do whatever's working for you. And you might even try an experiment. You might thin in some areas and not in others and see what happens.
I've never done that.
I've often been pleasantly surprised by
I
this.
just don't like to pull up a little. If I see a little carrot sprouting, I just want to leave it there. Just let us see what happens. You get a lot of those double carrots.
There's even an in-between where you could pull some of them while they're like baby carrots, and you get baby carrots to eat. And
There's seed tape, where it comes spaced on the tape.
Oh, okay. I've never done that. Usually just split up. Okay.
So let's see. So these were my parsnips from summer, and then I think these are beets, and then we've got my beans. This might look crowded, but in fact, everything has exactly the right amount of space. And the only way I can get that to work is by transplanting.
All of the seed things that I say is that don't put it too close together. Like with tomatoes, it says space them 24 inches apart. Should I put something between them that won't compete with them, or?
So, my teacher, John Jevons, has spent 40 years figuring out what are the optimal distances for things. So, it's going to depend on the variety of tomatoes. Like sometimes you do those cherry tomatoes and they don't really get so huge. That might be a 12-inch. But I think, I've heard anywhere between 12 and 24 for doing tight spacing on tomatoes. And the book I go off of is called How to Grow More Vegetables, and it has a table in it. Or if you Google it, I think it's out there. But it has a table in it with the spacings, and they're pretty good. I've gotten really good luck on the spacings. So what's interesting is if you consider onions, technically these could be closer together, but the root space of an onion actually has parts that you can see and parts you can't see. So that's why we do it more 4 inches than say 2. Okay, so seedlings. I'm a big believer in seedlings, and here's one of the reasons is, so remember I showed you that picture of the tight spaced lettuce and the row lettuce? Well, there's another flavor of that, which is, okay, I can probably grow 150 seedlings in this and then transplant them. Can you imagine watering this? Okay, that's easy, right? And I can move it around and keep it moist. To water 150 seedlings in my garden, especially at the germination phase where I'm scared of them drying out, that's going to take a bunch of water, and it's going to be nerve-wracking. Let's say we have a hot day and I got to water the second time and I can't get over there. So I really like growing seedlings. Now, one of the alternatives, of course, to growing seedlings is that you can buy them. But whatever you do, I think it's a very nice high percentage bet. One of the things I like about seedlings too, so this is my quinoa. I grow quinoa every year. And there's these little weeds that just don't have a chance because they stand out so much. Now, because my quinoa is on 12-inch centers, it's very easy for me to go with a hula hoe in between and hoe out the weeds until the quinoa gets too big, and then it just doesn't work. Yeah, the weeds just don't have a chance here. Let's see. One interesting thing about seedlings is I think if you can, it's one of these areas where if you can buy organic seedlings, I think it's worth doing. The organic seeds, I think, are great. There's probably less difference, but the organic seedlings, I think there is more of a difference. Also, just my own unofficial opinion is I really don't buy seedlings from the big box stores because I've heard stories of them getting aggressive with the folks who are actually growing the seedlings and putting some of them out of business. So I try to buy from my local nursery wherever they are. We have one in San Mateo, and the guy knows all of the people he buys from, and he knows their stories, and he's very careful about who he buys from. So
Is that the one by the freeway?
yeah, it's Golden Nursery
Oh,
at
yeah, I
Third.
love that name.
Yeah, they're good folks. Okay, the seed situation is confusing, and so let me try to explain it to you. First of all, as home gardeners, we don't need to worry about GMO seeds because we can't buy them and they aren't sold to us, thank God. So, not an issue for us at home. However, we got to deal with hybrids. I don't really understand or want to get into the biology of it too much, but here's the problem with a hybrid plant is that if you were to save the seeds and then plant them again, you wouldn't get the same thing. You would get a whole variety of different variations of the two parent plants. I just don't like that concept, I guess. I want to really grow stuff where I could save the seeds, and every year I save more and more seeds. But it's an art in and of itself. So I'm really looking for something that's open pollinated or heirloom. Heirloom seeds are by definition open pollinated. They're just, they have history. They go back to, I think it's World War II. There's some year that people have said, actually got it written down here. Heirlooms are before 1940 is an heirloom seed. So the heirlooms and the open pollinated seeds, you can plant them, you can save the seeds, and you'll get the same thing again. So that's really nice. The hybrids you won't, even if they're organic hybrids. So for me personally, if it says hybrid, I won't plant it, I won't buy it. Kitazawa Seed Company does really great Asian seeds especially, but you gotta watch, because I'd say 20% of what they sell is hybrid. But they'll typically have non-hybrid stuff too to choose from. Let's see. I'll pass these around. Here's two of my favorite seed companies. Let's see, so this one, Bountiful Gardens, is a nonprofit. They're up in Willits, and what's cool about them is they grow, they test grow and actually literally produce many of the seeds that they put out there. And they're in California, so if they've been able to grow it in Willits, there's a good chance it'll grow around here. Pass this around. And then these guys, Baker Creek, they actually, every year, they do the Heirloom Seed Festival that's up in Santa Rosa, something like that. I've never been, but people say it's wonderful. They also, in Petaluma, they have a seed store. They call it the Seed Bank or something like that. And if you ever happen to be by, it's the most amazing store. Never seen so many different seeds in one place. Very exciting.
Bank.
But yeah, it's in an old bank. Yeah, and yeah. So this is a good company as well.
What's that one called again?
That's Baker Creek. So if you are going to grow seedlings, really the only thing that you need to know is that it's got to have some sort of drainage. Other than that, you can use a variety of containers.
If you put 150 seedlings in there, how do you transplant without wrecking the soil? I mean, you want to.
Yeah. So what I'll do? Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll get a little hand fork, right? And I'll go and loosen. And then I have a little thing that basically looks like a butter knife, and I'll take that and I'll kind of. It's a delicate
soil for it.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've found over the years is like and I always mispronounce the Brassicaceae family, broccoli, kale, all those
Brassica,
folks.
yeah.
Brassica, right.
Yeah.
You can almost abuse those seedlings. Like I just pull them right out, and as long as I'm putting them in the ground and not crushing the roots, like they tend to just take off. And I've always wondered, that's like the hardiest. I've tried doing that with like beets and no, they don't respond the same way. You gotta do it a little more gentler.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, can you comment on that as far as like within the vegetable kind of kingdom? What?
I found that onions are the most sensitive. And in fact, this year I threw in the towel for now and said I'm just gonna buy onion seedlings. I'm gonna try onion sets too, just because I've always had poor yields growing onions from seed. And there's some trick to it. Part of it too is that I don't use any special mix. I don't use a potting mix or a seeding mix or anything like that. Again, because I don't want to buy stuff, right? So I'm just, so that's probably part of it. The onions, when they first start, the root structure is so small that you can knock them over by watering. It's kind of, it sucks. Yeah, I found, I actually transplant, for instance, beets without any problem. They do well. I do a golden beet, which is called a mangle, and the small ones are about a pound.
Wow.
So I've got some that are probably going on 4 or 5 pounds this year from the winter. So yeah, and those were transplanted. So yeah.
Cool.
Let's see. So as I mentioned, for my seedling soils, I just use a combination of garden soil and compost, nothing fancy, and that's worked fine. I don't sterilize it, I don't bake it, nothing, and I've been fine. And when I germinate, I'll have them in a container like this just until they pop. Probably earlier than this is when I would move them. And if you don't move them, they get leggy like this as they're searching for light. So you just gotta pay attention. Okay, transplanting. So the way, one of the key things before transplanting is to have the soil ready. So I'll loosen it with a fork, I'll single dig it. I'll get lots of water into it, which is actually really critical. I think before you transplant or before you plant is your best chance to get a nice moist garden bed to plant into. And if I don't plant into it right away, then I definitely want to cover it. Burlap is good, or again, the shade cloth, or even both.
How long is too long to keep it covered? I mean, we should plant it in what, like a week, 2 weeks, or,
I wouldn't want it uncovered for more than a day, honestly.
And when you cover it, are you good for how long?
Yeah, for a while.
For a while,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, as long as you keep it moist. Yeah. Yeah. It can be kind of tricky with the timing, like when you have a chance to prepare the bed might be different than when you have your seedlings bought or grown or whatnot. So those gaps do happen. Let's see, you'll definitely want to transplant when it's on the cooler side of things. I had many incidents last year where I was ready to transplant and we had a heat spell that went 3 days. And you really don't want to mess with that. The transplanting process, it's tough on the plants and you want to give them every possible advantage. Let's see, this is something I got from Weather Underground that they have for all kinds of locations, and they'll tell you when it starts to cool down in a day. So that's a good point to get out there. I'll aim for the last day of a hot spell about around, I can't, this was for February, but for whatever the day is, this would have been around 4 p.m. I'll go out there and start transplanting. Because in that way, you get your seedlings into the ground, you get the ground nice and moist. It's going to stay moist for at least, probably 18 hours. So it's a nice introduction. Then also, after I transplant, I always put a shade cloth over it for maybe a week, sometimes longer. I use yardsticks to get the spacing just right. You'll note that this is what's called an offset center. So this row and this row are exactly aligned, and this one is off by half. And then the spacing is 8 inches at every kind of trio. It doesn't, my teacher, John, is really exact. Like, he comes from an engineering background, as do I, but I guess I'm a sloppier engineer, because I can't get it perfect, but I try to get it close, and the plants kind of take care of the rest. They'll fill in the spaces. So I definitely do the shade cloths. So these are like stakes that I bought at the store that I use to stake these. This is actually like a PVC cloth, or a piece of PVC that's attached to the end of the cloth to kind of keep it over there. If you want to keep birds out of here, then you've definitely got to make sure that the ends are down. And actually, I saw a couple of beds over at the community garden that have really nice bird and netting protection. So they're doing it right. So yeah, I definitely try to keep consistent moisture. I think that's really important. And now I want to talk about weeds. So here's a few of the strategies that I've tried for weeds. One of them is what's called pre-sprouting, and this can help especially going into a fall season because just the kind of weather that we get in the fall is perfect for weeds. And so one of the things that you can do is you can clear out your summer stuff and then water it as if you've just put in a crop, right? Or especially if it's raining, that's another case, and you see what comes up, because everything that's going to be coming up is going to be a weed. And then you can go in with your hula hoe or whatnot and take all of that out. Some of the organic farms are using that kind of thing too. They're using pre-sprouting. And actually this was funny, this was a couple seasons ago, and these little wispy things are my cereal rye. It just got overwhelmed by all of the other weeds that came out. Okay, another idea you can try is called solarization, where you get basically you just get like a transparent sheet of plastic and you put it over the soil, and then it heats up. And that heat apparently will kill a lot of weed seeds.
What does it do to worms?
So the optimistic answer of what it does to the worms is that they go down or they go elsewhere, but I don't know for sure.
Because I've raised beds that I don't know where they could go. I would have to go down pretty deep to get out.
Yeah, it might depend how well loosened the soil is under the gopher cloth or whatever. But I imagine it gets fairly, and it's going to depend too on what you're growing. Some of the things that we could grow, like so for instance, I like to grow sorghum in the summer, and that puts down really deep roots. And the same thing, the cereal rye in the winter. So I think my soil gets loosened far below where I can dig.
What's the deepest you've ever found a worm?
Probably about a foot, honestly.
If they're burrowing type worms, you get about 3 feet down. They come up and down and aerate your ground. For red wrigglers, you've got maybe compost material on top, and they basically stay on top of the soil, but under your mulch. So in your garden, you won't see as many red wrigglers, but burrowers you'll see more of.
Got it. So there's different types, and some of them are
Right.
deeper. That makes sense.
And they're invertebrates. They squeeze through really, really narrow spaces, and they move. They get out of the way. They'll get out of the way from that type of heat.
So actually, I have a question for you, since you know a lot about compost.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So when I harvested my compost yesterday,
Okay.
there were far more worms this year than last year.
More
Same
water.
compost, same recipe.
More water.
Okay.
Last year was much drier than this year.
Okay.
And then they know, and then they know where to go to, then they show up.
Got it.
If you build it, they will.
Got it. So because there was more water this year, then I had more worms.
Yes.
Oh, good to know. Okay. I just know if I'd done something wrong, or
No, it's great. You want worms in your compost.
yeah.
They're decomposers.
Do you think at some point you get too many? Is that
No,
possible?
because they control their own birth rate and so forth. I have worm bins, and they don't get overloaded. They just stop producing as
They
much.
self-regulate. Yeah, I actually took a bunch from the compost pile and took them home to put in my bins.
Mhm.
Yep. Thank you.
With coffee grounds,
Yep.
raise worms and coffee grounds.
Mhm.
I don't know if that work in a compost.
What's your
In the
take on that?
compost,
Just
yes,
as a-
but if you're using it for vermicompost, it's too acidy. 'Cause I did an experiment with Lane Weber, and we put coffee grounds inside a coffee bin, and all the worms came into the lid and stayed in the lid. They wouldn't get into the coffee grounds, it was too much.
Do you
But
mix
if it's
any
just
in?
one bit here and there, it's not that
Oh,
bad.
okay, got it. So it's a matter of how much you put in.
Right, you don't want it saturated with, but in your compost, no problem, because it tends to get mixed and stuff. I do turn my compost bins.
Right. So let's see, another thing that I've been playing with is, because I'm planting on these very exact kind of lines with spacings in between, it leaves me space to go in. This is a hula hoe or a stirrup hoe, and I got one that's actually quite narrow. It's about like that. And so I can go in between here and get the early weeds without having to